Good afternoon, everybody. Great to see you all here at the forum. I'm Alexis Abramson. I'm the Dean of the Climate School, and really pleased to welcome you to our final Signature Speaker Series event of Spring 2025. Thank you for joining us, both here in person. We also have people online as we wrap up a full month of programming in honor of Earth Month. So through the Signature Speaker Series, we bring distinguished speakers to the climate school. So scholars and practitioners, innovators and leaders to share their insights on climate research, policy, and solutions. This series is one of the many ways we connect the Columbia community and the public with the critical work needed to truly confront the climate crisis. So thank you again for being part of today's conversation and for your continued engagement with the Climate School. I am pleased now to introduce Radley Horton, Professor of Climate at the Climate School, who will introduce our speaker.
It's a privilege to have the chance to introduce Katie today. I think I first got to work with Katie as we started advancing our managed retreat conferences back in June of 2019. They've been happening every 2 years, which if you do the math means that this June 16th to 18th, quick plug, we'll be having another one of these managed retreat conferences and encourage folks to join. But Katie really has emerged as one of the sort of central in the US figures advancing both intellectually and from a practice perspective, work in that managed retreat space, right? So thinking about describing the complexity of some of the wicked problems around managed retreat and relocation, but also simultaneously moving forward the practice dimension of things. So engaging around how do we do buyouts? How do we look into zoning questions? How do we think about other aspects of municipal governance? So very solutions focused, which I'm sure will be a theme of the talk today, and always focused around those communities who bear the least responsibility for these wicked problems that we've gotten ourselves into, and who stand to suffer the most, as tends to be the case for a variety of issues. And then I guess another thing to say is that I've had the opportunity this semester to launch a class in climate risk assessment, which has been really exciting. And I kind of knew from the beginning that I wanted to try to engage sort of frontier topics that go beyond just quantitative predictions of how risks are going to change in the future. I wanted to get into broader issues of complexity, compound extreme events, the ways that vulnerability is connected to climate hazards, how impacts span across sectors, and things like how some of the solutions that we come up with for emissions reductions, for adaptation, will themselves have changed the risks and sort of hazards in these complex ways. So I started building out a syllabus, looking for papers that we should read every week. And soon I noticed that like Katie's papers were pretty much like every week in the semester. So I was like, from a content perspective, that was great. But then I was like, maybe I need to dial this back a little bit so the students aren't like, why are you reading the same person every week? But was able to, there's so many to include. So it's a real honor, Katie, to have you here. I will now just sort of quickly read sort of some of the highlights from her bio. Katie's a professor and chair of the Department of Environmental Science and Policy at the University of Miami Rosenstiel School of Marine, Atmospheric, and Earth Science. During spring 2025, she's the Coleman P. Burke Distinguished Visiting Professor at Yale School of Environment. Her research assesses climate change risks and response options to address increased flooding, heat, wildfire, and other hazards. Through innovative approaches to integrating evidence, she informs adaptation to all risks. She has served as a chapter lead and author in the 4th through 6th U.S. National Climate Assessments. I'll pause here to note the information a lot of you may have heard about the next National Climate Assessment, at least being a sort of meaningful and real contribution, as the prior have been very much in jeopardy, to say the least, right now. She's also been lead author and science director for the IPCC 5th and 6th assessment reports. She was the 2020 recipient of the Piers Sellers Prize for world-leading contribution to solution-focused climate research, and she received her PhD from Stanford and AB summa cum laude from Harvard College. Katie, great to have you here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Radley and Alexis, for the really warm welcome. It is wonderful to be here. I mostly have been here for those managed retreat conferences, so it's my first time in this space, really a lovely place to be. So what I'll do today is describe, as Radley very nicely introduced, how I think about climate risk. And indeed, climate risk, no matter how you cut it, is very complex. There are a lot of determinants, a lot of interactions, a lot of drivers, and frameworks for embracing that complexity are absolutely essential for understanding who is impacted and how in a changing climate, and what the options are for responding effectively. Okay, so we've had lots of issues with the clicker. So, sorry, we go next slide, please. We tried it 14 different ways, but we're giving up here. Okay, I'm gonna do three things today. Number one, I will show you the glasses through which I view the world, how I think about the nature of climate risk, and how we really need to think about integrative approaches for probing that complexity and making our knowledge of the risks relevant to increasing preparedness. And then I'll draw out my view of climate risk and adaptation through two examples that have really caught my imagination in recent years. First, I will talk about what we call chronic heat. So what happens when heat doesn't just come in a few days of a heat wave, but what happens when your heat wave lasts months at a time? What does that do for the complexity of risk and how it unfolds household by household, individual by individual within a region, as we're moving into a world where much more of the globe will be chronically hot, not just episodically hot into the future. And the last example I will give, I think we are all in need of some good news when it comes to climate risk and adaptation. And this is fun, exciting research that kind of started out with this impulse of understanding retreat. When do we move out of the most dangerous places? But actually look for the success stories where retreat is never needed because the development patterns were really successful and proactive in the first place. And oftentimes people haven't even realized that. Okay, so starting out with item number one here, we'll go to the next slide, please. Great. So if there's one thing to take home about those glasses through which I see the world, we need to take an integrative approach that is decision relevant, oriented towards action, and often that means that a lot of collaboration is necessary. Next slide, please. So for many different reasons, 2025 has been a banner year when it comes to climate change. There are so many ways to think about the degree to which it has been a banner year, but I'll just start with what I rolled out into 2025 with. Last year, 2024, was the first year on record where the global temperature increase above pre-industrial levels exceeded 1.5 degrees Celsius, right? This abstract number, but to put that in perspective, our global temperature goal under the Paris Agreement is aiming to limit warming well below 2 degrees Celsius, pursuing 1.5. And so last year was that first year where we hit above that level for a single year. We can dial back in this record here, which goes back all the way to 1850. You can kind of look at the year you were born and say, where were we there versus where are we now? And I think for me, what's interesting is, in the 1980s and the 1990s, in those decades, adaptation, so increasing preparedness for the climate change that has already occurred, adaptation was viewed effectively as a dirty word. Don't say it because we're not going to need it. We're going to reduce our emissions of heat-trapping gases, and that will be the primary way that we deal with this challenge. As here we are in 2025, though, increasingly we realize that yes, the most effective way to prepare and adapt is to rein in our emissions of heat-trapping gases. But at the same time, we've got to do a lot more to get ready, recognizing that we are increasingly behind the 8 ball in terms of the challenges of a changing climate. So in the next 4 slides, I will take this abstract concept of where we are right now and give you a few different entry points for thinking about aspects of climate risk that are important, foundational, and very hard to prepare and adapt to. Next slide, please. Okay, first key point. Climate risk emerges from many different determinants simultaneously. We can take the catastrophic fires that unfolded across LA County at the start of this year as a perfect example. So many different factors on the climate side, in terms of the development patterns, in terms of the sensitivity of that development to not just wildfire, but suburban fires become urban fires. And I think what is really breathtaking about this example is that California has done a huge amount of adaptation. We have lots of programs to harden homes, to prepare communities, to make sure insurance can work better, to make sure evacuation happens better, to make sure firefighting capabilities are at their maximum potential. And still, these types of disasters, where pretty much anyone looking at this would say these risks are intolerable, are still unfolding. Okay, so that's challenge one. So many different factors interacting in climate risk on top of our best efforts to prepare and adapt. Next slide, please. A next feature of climate risk is that increasingly it is unprecedented. So this is an image of hurricane damage. It's an image of hurricane damage in a place that did not know it was really exposed to damaging hurricanes, much less flooding. So this is Western North Carolina, where Hurricane Helene dropped intensive rainfall, leading to catastrophic flash floods last year. So thinking about the fact that we know in our best empirical historical examples that we are pretty good at preparing for the last disaster we saw, whether it's a drought or a flood, we are not good at preparing for things we have not experienced historically. And increasingly, the climate challenges are the ways that these climate hazards are not in our historical set of experience and really requiring new ways of preparing and adapting. Next slide, please. Third example of a key feature of climate risk is something that is often called the new normal. So this is sunny day flooding. It's not a storm context. It's just the ways in which rising seas are coming into daily life. And you can point to rising seas or chronic heat, not the disasters, just the slow onset, the chronic hazards that are increasingly becoming part of everyday life. And then again, if we think about our science on these new normals, historically, we have not quantified the impacts socially, economically. Again, this is a frontier where we really don't know what's going to happen as societies go from current seas to 4 feet of sea level, where we might be doing a backflow preventer right now to deal with our current level of sea level rise, and we know at some point that's not going to work. What is that transition like? We really don't have any empirical precedents. Next slide, please. And the last example I'll give is when we think about climate risk, another last key feature to drive home here is that what happens in a given place does not stay in that place or in that time period in terms of the impacts that it has. On the left there, we see Paradise, a city appropriately named in California in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada mountain range. The Camp Fire came through Paradise in 2018, killed 85 people, destroyed 19,000 structures, and led to the evacuation of 50,000 people. Paradise has since recovered and did a really beautiful job of rebuilding in a much safer way, building in fire breaks into the community. But when we think about the impacts of that fire, the Camp Fire to the current day, we can't just look at Paradise. So 50,000 people evacuated during that fire. They largely went down the hill into the California Valley, many of them landing in Chico, California. Actually the place where our mother was born. Okay, in Chico, they already had a housing affordability crisis. Add in 50,000 people overnight, 8 hours to prepare for an influx of 50,000 people. Obviously not much preparation is going to be possible. And suddenly you've got traffic everywhere. The sewage system can't handle the inputs into the sewage treatment facilities. And the unsheltered population goes through the roof. You can run that forward the next year, into the year after that, and suddenly you now have the COVID pandemic on top of that hazard. And so the housing affordability crisis went even worse as we headed into that telecommute era. There was a political action committee in Chico that really stoked fears and said we've got skyrocketing housing prices. We've got criminals who aren't housed, whether that was true or not. And that led to a lot of turning the unsheltered populations into a view of something that needed to be suppressed and eradicated, recognizing that Indigenous people in that area were disproportionately represented in the unhoused. Then you can add on top of that the many, many fires that have happened in that region since then, where it's not just about the direct hazards of flames, but also the exacerbating air quality. Okay, so when we say adapt, we need to handle all of these different types of complexities, the many determinants, the unprecedented risks, the new normals, and these profound cascades that mean that it's not actually easy to tease out what's going to happen where and when. Next slide, please. But the nice part of this equation is that actually responses to the changing climate are blossoming, no matter where you look. I will draw out a number of different examples from my hometown of Miami-Dade County. And if you look at that region, this is just the surface of the examples I could be listing here, whether it's local government, state government, federal government, community organizations, business, private sectors, homeowners, householders, renters. Lots and lots of people are taking action to prepare and adapt. Next slide, please. One figure I like quite a lot, although it's a little wonky and probably hard to see from the audience here, is this one. This is one of the few places where everyone taking action to adapt, in this case in the context of sea level rise, has been well quantified. And so this is looking at everyone in the San Francisco Bay Area that is adapting to sea level rise. And so in the first image there, called Time 1 Network, we see that up until the period ending in 2007, there were 82 agencies of government, businesses, and community organizations that were working on sea level rise adaptation at that time. Jump forward to Time 5 Network, ending in 2016. And by that time, perfect. Jumping forward to 2016, at that point in time, suddenly we were up to 647 agencies of government, businesses, community organizations taking action to prepare and adapt for sea level rise. So 82 to 647 in about a decade. I think that is the type of growth we are seeing in many, many places around the world, whether or not it's been quantified. So an abundance of governance, an explosion of governance in many different ways. Next slide, please. So the next question is, with all of this effort to prepare and adapt, is it working? And this is where the story gets a lot more complex. As Radley described, I've been very involved with a lot of international and national assessment efforts, aiming to figure out what is the state of climate risk, but in this work also, what is the state of climate adaptation? Looking around the world, what are our best efforts to increase preparedness for the range of hazards that people face? This one wedge diagram here is looking only at a summary of what's happening along coastlines around the globe, but it's quite representative of what we see across a range of different empirical and assessment methods. So in this diagram, there are 6 different wedges, and each wedge represents one way of thinking about how much we are adapting at present, increasing preparedness for intensifying climate change. And as you go outwards in this wedge, the more color you see, the orange to the dark blue there, that is indicative of how much adaptation has happened in that category. So the top wedge, we're doing really well. One place where we're basically knocking it out of the park. We're not all the way to level 4 of very high levels of adaptation, but we're high, kind of on average across the board. And that means that we are doing a good job of assessing hazards, vulnerability, exposure, and responses. So take Radley's course. This is what we are doing a great job at around the globe. Where does it get a little bit more complicated? Okay, so next, plans. So as many of you are familiar with, if you're going to think about how to develop adaptation across agencies of government, integrating the public and private sector and civil society, step 1 is often developing a plan. So we're seeing a moderate amount of development of plans, leading in the next wedge to actions and building of capacities. But where this falls off a cliff is in the last 2 wedges here. So for almost no adaptation around the globe, do we know if it is working in reducing risks? And in fact, where we have been able to empirically measure how much risk reduction is occurring, the answers in net on aggregate aren't great. It's usually negligible in terms of some projects might be effective, but we're not really moving the needle in terms of bringing risk levels down overall. And then the final wedge there is the connection between the near term and the long term. So if you put in that backflow preventer to help seawaters not come into your downtown, how does that near term small incremental action, often kind of piecemeal across the society, connect with what might be needed in the longer term? And we could point to maybe the Netherlands as the one place in the world that is doing an awesome job of connecting near-term action with long-term preparedness, and we kind of don't see it anywhere else. Next slide, please. So putting all of these pieces together, we really need to ask, how do we get from where we are now to a future that will be safe and vibrant under intensifying climate change? And there's no one right answer. It's going to differ in many different parts of the world, under different sectors, under stress from those chronic and acute climate shocks and stressors. But I think that's really the wide open, powerful, and frankly, really inspiring question for adaptation today. Next slide, please. So my toolkit in research, and as Radley described, it really is aiming towards action, connecting knowledge and action in that process of research, has 3 pillars. Number 1, we need to think hard about the way that climate risk is not just about the climate system, the climate hazards, those sharp edges of the climate system, but instead how those hazards interact with so many different factors across societies, economies, our governance systems broadly defined, and how sometimes risk is going to be highly variable individual by individual in ways that we would never guess based on our best understanding of what the climate hazard itself is. Number 2, oftentimes we think about, what do we know about adaptation? It is the case that no scientist or researcher is going to be able to support adaptation solo. This is a collaborative enterprise where it requires action from the individual scale to the global scale and everything in between. And oftentimes the knowledge essential for effective adaptation is going to be local knowledge, institutional knowledge, and yes, the technical knowledge is often essential, but it is usually very far, far from sufficient in itself. And then finally, what works in the space of law and policy tools and governance approaches? When do we need to do tried and true things at bigger scale versus when do we need to try radically new approaches for reining in risks? Next slide, please. Okay, those are the glasses through which I see the world. We're now going to head into 2 examples, taking some of those themes and applying them first. Next slide, please. To this context of chronic heat, where here the basic idea is that when you experience a climate stressor for months at a time, what is experienced across the population is going to be highly differentiated. So in the context of chronic heat, so think about the tropics around the world, some people might be in climate controlled spaces and comfortable no matter what the outdoor temperatures are, whereas others are going to be grappling with all sorts of trade-offs and interconnections that mean that that climate stressor lasting for months at a time is going to ripple through their lives in really complex and consequential ways. Next slide, please. Okay, this is a map that is a little rich with the number of things layered on top of it, but I'm going to walk you through it because I think it makes a really important point. The way we tend to think about heat is through this lens of heat waves. So the shading on the continents around the world here has this color bar that corresponds to the number of heat wave events defined by the World Meteorological Organization as 5 days that are 5 degrees Celsius hotter than typical conditions in that location. And so what we see here is that as you head to the northern latitudes, there are a large number of heat wave events by this type of definition. And certainly some of you might be familiar with, for example, the heat waves that have occurred in Russia with very, very high mortality. These can be hugely consequential events. Here in New York City, tons of experience with heat waves as well and their consequences. Okay, anything odd about this figure? In some ways, the odd thing is that the black area of the world there, where there have been fewer than 10 heat waves in that historic record, are really hot places. So what's going on? So this is where we need to pull in another measure, and this is going to be the little dots across the map here, and the color bar corresponding to them is this rightmost bar here. The number of days where the heat index, combining temperature and humidity, exceeds 90 degrees Fahrenheit in the maximum. And so what we see here is this difference between heat waves traditionally defined and chronic heat, where it is just hot a whole lot of the time, not with a lot of variability, just consistently really hot. And if you look in this bottom inset at Singapore or Malaysia or Indonesia, you're pushing towards almost the entirety of the year that is hitting up against that threshold or above of 90 degrees Fahrenheit heat index basically every single day of the year. So I'm going to play with this theme of what is the nature of chronic heat and its risks in Miami-Dade County, Florida, the other inset down there. But keep in mind that some of the trade-offs that will unfold could be arguably even more relevant in other parts of the world. Next slide, please. So the wisdom, right, with chronic heat, if it's hot all the time, is that it's not a problem because we sit in climate-controlled spaces, like we all are today, super comfortable, right? Where does this fall apart? So a first category of exposure is going to be what happens in the space of outdoor work. I think if we all consider agriculture, construction, there are so many jobs that we all depend on where the exposures to heat can be immense. Next slide, please. Those exposures can also be in indoor workplaces, for example, kitchens, where the outdoor conditions often exacerbate what is happening indoors. Exposures can happen during commutes, and they also can happen at home, right? We tend to think of home as our place of refuge above all, but think about, what is the quality of the building? What is the quality of the air conditioning system? Is the electricity reliable? Does a household have the money to run that electricity to cool their home? All of those become crucial interconnections to tease out and think about how hot people are for how much of the day across the year. Next slide, please. So one way to draw out this theme of cumulative exposure to chronic heat is to consider these different things that we do across the course of the day and how they add up to different levels of exposure to heat for different types of people. Okay, so in the top rows here, we have 4 scenarios for an individual who's exposed to heat at work and at home, next, just at home, next, just at work, and finally, just in their recreational time. And then in the bottom, you can just kind of think about what does that mean for your total exposure to heat across the course of the day if you are exposed all of the time versus a major segment at work or at home or just during your recreational time. And I would venture to say that people like us sitting in this room, presumably we're working indoors and presumably we're staying pretty comfortable at home. We are like a lot of decision makers setting policy. And I'm definitely like that bottom row where I like to run at 6 a.m., not play basketball at 6 p.m., but that's my main exposure. And in a state like Florida, the one type of heat protection that has been on the books forever is protecting kids playing sports after school. Right? We have had a much, much harder time to even think about the types of impacts that are occurring when people are exposed to heat on the job or in their homes. Although obviously there are a lot of starting points to build from. Next slide, please. So we've been doing a lot of work thinking both about these workplace exposures, especially outdoor work, as well as the exposures that occur in people's homes. What I'll walk through in the next few slides is some of what we have found, in particular thinking about heat exposures happening at home in Miami-Dade County, Florida. And what we're doing here is bringing together 2 silos that are often considered on their own. So number 1, how hot is a home? Number 2, how much are people paying for their electricity bills to keep their home cool? Energy burden, basically how much of your income are you spending on electricity, is a classic way of thinking of one dimension of that burden. And in these 2 silos, people either have analyzed how hot are people getting or what are they doing to pay for electricity without recognizing that they are going to interact in many profound ways. And so if you think about the types of documented factors that drive up the likelihood that you're going to be hot at home or paying a big fraction of your income towards your electricity bill, they often are the one and the same. The same types of factors drive up both types of risks, even though these 2 domains have existed in a very siloed way to date. Next slide, please. Okay, so in this work, we asked 3 different research questions. Number 1, how hot are people getting in their home? Number 2, how are households grappling with these dual challenges that involve trade-offs across them? How hot are they letting their home get? How much of their income are they paying to keep their home cool? And then number 3, what are the pathways or the sets of factors leading to people to high heat exposure or high energy burden, or as we'll get to here in a second, sometimes both. Next slide, please. Okay, so in the spirit of collaboration and action-oriented research, this was very much a collaborative effort that's building from something called the Urban Heat Research Group, established by Professor Amy Clement in Miami-Dade County and going for quite a long time now. So Amy is a climate scientist. She's also a dual grad from Columbia, both her undergrad and her PhD, and really a rock star thinking about not just the climate side of chronic heat, but how do you build these relationships, bringing together local governments and a wide range of community organizations, such that our research findings can directly inform emerging heat policy. The students who have led this work are known as the Superheat Trio for a reason. They really combine disciplines across a very wide range. Nkosi Muse is a meteorologist, Myra Cruz is a public health specialist, Lene Turk-Hankins is an engineer, thinking about heat moving through the built environment. This work also involved a partnership with Catalyst Miami very, very directly. Natalia Brown, who was then an employee at Catalyst, she's now at Harvard Law School, was a key partner working with us in a lot of different communities. Next slide, please. Okay, so in this study, we basically wanted to recruit households, aiming for maximum diversity across neighborhoods in the county, across different factors that might be leading to high risk, where the main goal was to say, do you feel too hot? Do you feel like you're paying too much for your electricity bill to keep your home cool? Aiming for the broadest range of participants in our study under those two questions. We recruited in the 3 major languages specific to Miami-Dade County: English, Haitian Creole, and Spanish. Next slide, please. And so this is Miami-Dade County cut in 2, just so we can see it a little bit more clearly. The county is about the size of Rhode Island, here with northern part of the county on the left and the southern part of the county on the right. Each census block with color in it is where we had a household, 57 in total, where we worked with them over the course of the heat season in 2022 to answer those 3 questions about their experience with heat and energy burden as well. To give a feel, the 3 students in deploying the sensors and doing surveys and interviews across these households drove 800 miles in total for the first drop-off and 800 miles in total for the pickup at the end of the project. So really a major effort to make this thing happen. Next slide, please. Okay, so for the measurements, we actually built from a lot of work here that's been done at Columbia, thinking hard about what types of sensors are best in homes. And what we decided to do was have sensors that measured temperature and humidity every 10 minutes and transmitted that data in real time via the cloud to our computers. This is important, number one, because a lot of things can go wrong over the course of a 6-month deployment, and this way we knew if a sensor ever stopped measuring. It also meant that if a house was getting dangerously hot, for our IRB protocol for the study, we could reach out to them, see how they're doing, and connect them with resources across the course of the study. Next slide, please. So the first thing we did was think about this question of, when they say they're too hot, what does that actually mean? Based on those temperature measurements, I'm just going to work with temperature here, we'll bring in humidity in a moment. Based on the temperature, we came up with 19 different variables that are commonly used to think about the average temperature in a home, the variability across the course of the day, and different lags that can occur. And we squashed down those 19 variables through very max rotated principal component analysis, followed by k-means clustering. If that's jargon to you, don't worry about it. We'll go to the next slide, please. To get to 4 different types of heat signature. So the technical side was on the first paper, previous slide rather, and here we're just going to look at it in terms of 2 representative weeks within a single home for each of these different clusters. So diurnal cool would be houses that are doing great. That black wiggly line there shows the temperature at the Miami-Dade airport, a good standard representation of a long-running temperature measurement in the region. So the black wiggly line is the daily variation in temperature at the airport, and the black dotted line in that diurnal pool would be the average temperature at the airport over this 2-week period. Then the red line shows the temperature measurement in this example home over that 2-week period. And so we can see in that diurnal pool example, it's wiggling. We're seeing that outdoor signature appearing indoors as well. And the set point is really cool. They're keeping that home a lot cooler than the outdoor conditions. Stepping to diurnal moderate, a similar thing, but the set point in the home in their air conditioning system is higher. Noisy moderate, by contrast, is what we call the engineer's nightmare. There's no consistent relationship between what is happening outdoors and what is happening in the temperature experienced within the home. a lot of things could be going on. We had one couple that was continuously fighting about the set point on their AC system. So, you know, engineer's nightmare, you've got to pull in a lot of other decision sciences to get a hold of that one. But the right bottom area here, labeled diurnal hot, these are the households that are really of concern from this perspective of heat exposure. So you can see in this example, that indoor temperature is mirroring what is happening outdoors. So has anyone spent the summer in the tropics? Yeah, so like trying to go for a jog in the middle of the day, like you would just collapse. Like thinking about what that heat looks like with very high levels of humidity on top of it, it's kind of breathtaking to realize that these households are basically just mirroring the outdoors. Next slide, please. Okay, here we'll dive into a few more examples of homes in that bottom right, highly heat exposed category. On the left, we have homes that were actually even more concerning than just mirroring what was happening outdoors. Those are homes that are functioning as a greenhouse. So the lowest temperature indoors is not getting anywhere close to the lowest temperature outdoors. And that lowest temperature outdoors with humidity on top of it is still really hot. So these are profound examples of thinking about when a household says they are too hot, what do they really need? Next slide, please. Okay, but as promised, our goal here was to bring together these two siloed domains. How hot are households getting? And how much of their electricity bill, or sorry, how much of their income are they paying for their electricity bill, which in the summer in a hot, humid location is largely going to air conditioning. On the horizontal axis, we have energy burden, the percent of household income going to their electricity bill, where that 6% notated by a vertical line there corresponds to our federal definition of energy poverty. So if you're paying more than 6% of your income to your electricity bill, you're considered to be in energy poverty. On the vertical axis there, we have the indoor heat index in the home. So heat index is a feels like temperature that is going to be more physiologically relevant than just temperature, especially in a humid location. So combining temperature and humidity into this feels like temperature. And I'll just note on the energy burden, note that that axis goes out to 30%. On the indoor heat, note that the axis goes up to 110. For in this left side, that is June, September, and October. Next slide, please. And then if we step to the hottest months of the year, July, August, you can see that those data points, where each data point is one of the 57 households, really pushing pretty high up this heat index up to 109, our hottest home for 2 months at a time, and up to energy burdens of 30%. Okay, so we're drawing these quadrants on here to give a feel of the nature of the trade-off families and households are facing and the choices they are making in light of those trade-offs. So in the bottom left quadrant, labeled neither heat nor energy burdened, those are the houses that are staying pretty cool and paying less than 6% of their income on their electricity bill. Good. They still say they're feeling too hot or the bills are too high, but by some nominal definitions, they're doing okay. Heat burdened only, by contrast, in that pink quadrant there on both sides of this figure are those households that are basically saying, we're just going to let it be hot. We're not going to turn on the air conditioning. In one case, the air conditioning system in a rental unit was broken, so they really didn't have an option to have centralized cooling. But most of the time, they're making that choice to say, we're just going to deal with the heat and we'll save money as a result. The bottom right would be those households that are energy burdened. They are paying up to 30% of their income, which is really a breathtaking level to try to stay cool. And here in the yellow quadrant, we have what has never been revealed in this deep siloing of our quantitative work across heat exposure versus energy burden. There are households that are paying a ton of money and it is still super hot in their homes. So these are households where they are already trying to make the trade-offs and the trade-offs are no longer working in terms of keeping them safe. Next slide, please. So not too surprisingly, the households that are experiencing high heat exposure and high energy burden have a lot of different consequences that are rippling across their lives. We did kind of a mini ethnography, an in-depth interview and study of each home with each household, and actually all households wanted to participate in that part of the study, and we're still working through the stories and the experiences shared by these many households. So here I'm just going to show a few survey results, where each row for each of these different statements corresponds to those 4 different quadrants. So households that were heat burdened or also even energy burdened were more likely to feel too hot at home, and also more likely to experience, in self-reports, physical or mental health impacts. And what was interesting was actually the households that were choosing to pay a lot for their electricity bills were actually more likely to say that they were having physical impacts from the heat, even though in many cases they were bringing down the temperature. And that really suggested something that we saw in the interviews as well, is, if you had a medical condition that made you more susceptible to the impacts of heat, you would be more willing to pay a lot of money to try to keep your home cool. We also saw a lot of limiting of air conditioning use, a lot of views that their energy bills were too high, and a lot of ways that that cascade started, where basically people would be saying, okay, I'm not going to go to the doctor, or I'm not going to do the grocery shopping that I should be to eat good food, in terms of the trade-offs, not just in those two quadrants of heat and energy. Next slide, please. Last of all, we applied what's called a fuzzy set qualitative comparative analysis. It's a set theoretic method, and all I'll say is it's really different from how social vulnerability is normally analyzed. And I think what's interesting for those of you who think about social vulnerability indicators, many of the recipes in terms of the factors coming together to drive up risk for households would be missed in those traditional social vulnerability analyses. Okay, so here we basically built from our best available theoretical understanding of what makes households susceptible to heat or energy burden, as well as a lot of empirical regressions, getting our head around what is going on in the region. And from there, we basically said, for households that are heat and or energy burdened, what are the combinations of factors landing them into those quadrants? So number one, low-income households with ineffective air conditioning. So this would be an air conditioning unit where you could be running it nonstop and it's just not able to cool the building. Number two, you could say low-income households that are trying to do the right thing. They are in a building that is pretty high quality with a good air conditioning system often. But by the time you're in, for a low-income household, a high-quality home with a good air conditioning system, you have no money left over to pay for that electricity bill. So this next quadrant of risk here are the housing-constrained low-income households. And the cross between 2 and 3 here is really vexing. So the flip side of that would be, okay, let's just go for the lower quality housing that's a lot cheaper. And that is the one place where actually households that were also moderate income were landing in these burden quadrants of heat and or energy burdened. Basically, if the roof is leaky or those windows are poor, oftentimes it's going to be the same set of factors leading to insects and rodents coming in and out of the house as well. Those households really had a hard time keeping their home cool. And then finally, low-income single-headed households were also very vulnerable, well aligned with the poverty literature more broadly. Next slide, please. And we might want to bring this up in the Q&A. There are very different responses relevant to each of these different categories, and this, over the last several months, has certainly been a rapidly moving landscape in terms of what the federal options look like and what that means for state and local action as well. Next slide, please. I'll just close this section of the talk by really emphasizing that by doing this in that urban heat research group started by Professor Amy Clement, we have been able to translate understanding of these differential risks across the population into directly supporting and informing emerging heat policy in the region. And by having this as a regular conversation that occurs every month with a whole lot of tag teams and spin-offs from there, it means that if new questions come up on the policy side, oftentimes those directly feed into what we were able to do next in the research. Next slide, please. Okay, so in the second part of the talk, I hope I've given you a feel of chronic heat and how it involves a lot of interconnections and trade-offs. And to understand the full magnitude of risk, it really is often not enough to think just about the climate components in that equation of risk. Next slide, please. In the last segment of my talk today, which will be quite a bit quicker, I will bring us back to this success story and these often under-recognized successes in terms of places that have avoided flood problems in the first place. It's kind of the example of eating broccoli your whole life and then not having heart disease later on. But the cool thing here is in terms of eating your broccoli, the towns that are doing really well didn't even think about it as broccoli. They just thought it was, the way that they should be doing things. Okay, next slide, please. So the two questions we ask here, number one, across the United States, how often are floodplain communities limiting their build out of the floodplain? So not putting people, houses, infrastructure, and assets into places prone to flooding. When we first proposed this research, the National Science Foundation, we had a reviewer rather, who said they didn't think we would find a single community across the entirety of the United States that was limiting development in flood-prone places. Okay, so keep that in mind. It's gonna be a little surprising. Question number two, if there are any such successes of proactive avoidance of building out of the floodplain, what law and policy tools lead communities to those more proactive adaptive actions? Next slide, please. So in a way, if we come back to this figure, Bradley nicely emphasized at the start that I've thought a lot about retreat. And we do think about retreat in this study largely through the mechanisms of buyouts. In a way, what we are also bringing together here is this concept of avoidance, avoiding building in dangerous places. And in a way, those are kind of two sides of the same coin. Historically, we do think more about retreat, and we know it is super hard for a lot of reasons that have been unfolded so effectively in the managed retreat conferences here at Columbia. And in a weird way, we kind of know less about avoidance because we often are selecting on the dependent, so to speak, looking at places that have big flood disasters and then asking what have they done to improve their outcomes. Next slide, please. So again, this is very collaborative work at the principal investigator level. It was with Miyu Kino, who's a quantitative social scientist, and A.R. Siders, who is a lawyer and social scientist focused on adaptation. And the students, again, spanned all sorts of disciplines, ranging from engineering to law to statistics to political science and beyond. Next slide, please. So what we did was develop a series of measures for every floodplain community across the entirety of the United States, asking what's going on with these patterns of development in land prone to flooding and land that we know to be less prone to flooding. For those of you who think about land use and planning, I give a lot of acronyms here if you are curious about exactly what data sets we were using. If you don't think about that, ignore the acronyms. So number one, we thought about property records that exist for homes. Where are the homes located? How much do they cost, for example? Next, we also thought about impervious surface. So as we think about development that is happening, building roads, building bridges, building warehouses, you are often going from land that is like a wetland or a forest into land that is a lot less impervious, or a lot more impervious. And so we use impervious surface as a proxy for development from all different types of development combined. Number two, we looked at the 1% annual chance floodplain as defined under FEMA. And I know, first question I always get from people who care about this type of stuff is, those floodplains underestimate risk. Yes, they do. But we use them because it's kind of hard, as we emphasized in that theme of the unprecedented being really hard to react to. It's hard to expect a local government to adapt to something that they don't know exists. So even though these are underestimates of risks in terms of the flood hazard maps we were applying, they are the regulatory floodplain maps that have been on the books for a long time, where it's a really good starting point for saying, then what happens if we update those flood maps into the future? So we brought together our measures of property and impervious surface with the flood hazard maps to come up with a few different types of measures, asking what is development like in terms of homes and development that is also commercial and industrial compared to the flood hazard that communities face. Next slide, please. So the key thing here was that we deliberately aimed for relative metrics. And I'm gonna unfold the importance of thinking about development relative to the flood hazard you face through this city that is a circular shape here. So we've got three different versions of our city of circle, and the area inside the circle in each case is the land that is developable in that city or town or county. So we're excluding super steep mountains or open water, just looking at land that could be developed. Next, we're saying in each town across the United States, how much of the town is floodplain, the blue color there, and how much of the town is outside of floodplain, the white color in each circle. Then next, we're saying, where are homes being built? And we do the same thing also for development overall, but these images are just for homes. And so for each of these three permutations here, hypothetical startup for what we're gonna work towards in terms of the real data, we see that 3 homes have gone into floodplain and 3 homes have gone outside the floodplain, but in each case, there's a different amount of flood hazard that is faced. So that top image there would be a community that is actually limiting floodplain development. Most of the town is floodplain and they're concentrating their development in the safest part of the town. Number 2 would be expected floodplain development, rolling the die, and it's 50-50 chance where the housing goes, for example. And then finally, we've got concentrated floodplain development. So that town there does not have very much floodplain, but disproportionately they're putting homes into it. Next slide, please. All right, so drum roll, please. Our first finding, either totally obvious or a huge surprise, depending on your starting point, is that not only is one community across the United States limiting development compared to the flood hazard they face, in fact, 74% of the over 18,000 communities nationwide are actually limiting development in their flood-prone areas. So this is kind of fascinating. It speaks to the degree to which we as flood researchers kind of have our blinders on. We start with the places that have a ton of build out in their floodplain and then ask what happens to get better. We don't necessarily look at the places that have avoided the problem in the first place. So that's the first kind of basic finding here, but maybe surprising, that most floodplain communities across the United States are actually limiting their build out of their floodplains compared to the flood hazard they face. Next slide, please. A next key twist in this research is that we tend to think about, a home is a home in a floodplain. However, what we actually find is that a typical home is less common in a floodplain as compared to really expensive housing and as compared to affordable housing. So this map nationwide shows how expensive homes are compared to other homes in the county. I'm actually going to mostly introduce it to the next slide, please. And why don't we have you hit one more advance while we're at it? Perfect. Okay, so what we're doing here, we're taking every home across the United States, and for each state, we are saying which measure of home value is most reliable. It actually depends state by state. Then within that state, we are saying what is the home value relative to home values across the state and percentiling every home within each state. And then we compare across states in a percentile way. So this is nice. It means that it's fair to compare, whatever it might be, Nebraska to New York, because we're only looking at relative values of homes. And so what we see here on the left for all homes nationwide, on the top purple there for inland communities and for the bottom for coastal communities, is that if you look at the 50 percentile, so kind of the median value, in all 3 of these cases, it is not the most common outcome. And so if you look, for example, in the inland communities, there's a lot of affordable housing occurring in floodplains and inland communities. So kind of think of the mosquito-ridden boggy swamp that's going to overtop every time it floods. Oftentimes that will be the naturally occurring affordable housing. By contrast, and maybe it's not a surprise, we see a huge coastal amenity effect, where in this bottom plot here, there is a lot of really expensive housing in coastal floodplains, largely because people love the view, and we know they love the view. However, if you design public policy, assuming that everyone is the median, and actually that's kind of the least common circumstance in many of these different domains, it really leads you to different thinking about where we're bearing risk and what effective responses are moving forward. Next slide, please. So the last thing we did here was ask for all of these successes, totally under-recognized in terms of limiting development in floodplains across the United States, what is actually happening? And this is kind of a risk diagram for those of you who like thinking about risk diagrams, even though it may not be totally obvious that it is. We're starting with the context. Are you an inland community or a coastal community? High wealth, low wealth, you have a lot of staff working on floodplain management or not. Stepping through to the actions that are being taken to manage land use within floodplains. Next, stepping to development, those measures I've been giving, where we're looking at where housing is being built and where other types of infrastructure and development is occurring. And then finally, there's a key question here of how susceptible is that construction to flood damages. So for those of you who think about flood depth damage curves, that would go there essentially, but I'm going to skip it for the time being. And then last of all, what happens in terms of the damages that emerge? Most studies to date have focused on the relationship shown by the blue arrows, basically saying what's the context, how many actions are people taking, and in the end, what damages occur. But the green point here, which is effectively an exposure metric, where is the development going, is a key intermediary for thinking about what are opportunities for limiting flood damages in the first place, nipping it in the bud because you're not building in flood-prone places in the first place. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Perfect. Okay, so for this deep dive, we focused in on the state of New Jersey. And this definitely was not convenient sampling because none of the principal investigators are from New Jersey. However, we did have some students from New Jersey who were excited to participate in the project. We focused in on New Jersey because it's got high demand for land, high demand for housing, relatively high flood damages, and relatively high local autonomy in terms of approaches that local governments can be taking. We didn't want to look at a Florida or a Texas or a Louisiana just because the nature of the flood beast is a little too wild. Our goal was to say, what is a state where if we're seeing successes there, they might be broadly transferable to other communities around the United States. And we applied a deliberately mixed method of analysis, thinking about some patterns happening across the state as a whole, then focusing in on a few different counties where we're looking at their hazard mitigation plans, for example, and then going full bore in depth, thinking hard about what is happening in the town codes, the town plans, the flood management behavior in 4 different municipalities to really tease out what's happening across that diagram that I showed on the previous slide. Next slide, please. So in the left side of the image here, we see a bar chart for all of the municipalities in New Jersey. The ones in red at the top are building out both development overall and housing units in particular in their floodplains. The purple towns are mixed. They're either building out in floodplains in commercial development or homes, but not both. In blue then, we have the large fraction there of municipalities that are limiting development of both housing and commercial and industrial uses in floodplains. And in fact, there were 126 municipalities in New Jersey that built no new units in the floodplain over the 2-decade period that we looked at, 2001 to 2019. And then what we did for coastal and inland was we picked those case study communities. And I'll walk through them in depth in a moment here. We worked with FEMA, the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection, and the local communities themselves to think about what are some of the key factors that might make communities exceptional or typical in terms of their outcomes. And what was kind of fascinating, again, kind of similar to this theme that we saw from reviewers thinking about this research in the first place, was that FEMA and New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection and Aberdeen and Lumberton themselves, across the board, everyone said, why are you looking at these communities? They are doing nothing special. So next slide, please. This might be the most exciting and important point here. Exactly. The communities that have been most proactive in limiting their build out of the floodplain do not think they are doing anything special. Instead, what we see is that they have been applying a few, and really a few, law and policy tools consistently through time. So for example, in the Lumberton example, they use transfer of development rights to steer development away from low density farmlands and open space into a densified non-flood prone part of town. In Aberdeen, they have a setback from the water paired with open space acquisition and affordable housing built outside of the floodplain. And in Woodbridge, that was kind of our mixed story. What we saw there was that they have done an amazing job of not just not building out their floodplains, but doing a very large number of buyouts to remove housing that was damaged very severely during Sandy. But they have allowed commercial development in their floodplain. And I spent several weeks on the ground in Woodbridge. Has anyone been to Woodbridge? Nope. Oh yeah, okay, we got one person in the back. So I thought of Woodbridge as kind of where New York City gets its Amazon boxes. In terms of that development along the waterfront, it was kind of endless warehouses. That's the type of development they were allowing in floodplains, but they were pulling homes through a lot of local government programs out of those floodplains. And then finally, we've got Weehawken. So they're kind of the opposite here, where they actually are actively encouraging development in the floodplain. We were also ground truthing all of our remotely sensed metrics of where development was occurring. And we thought in Weehawken that we really had pinpointed some issues with our methods because the development was happening in the water. We got there, in fact, the development was happening out over the water. They've got lawsuits going on. They are very deliberately not reducing development in the floodplain in interest of property values and being proximate to New York. Next slide, please. So what's been fun taking this work into the future is to think hard about, we've learned a lot about the past and successes that are under-recognized. How can we start to spin these pieces together to create more empowered understanding of those possible futures, such that some of the successes in the past that most of all might have been kind of routine and mundane can be paired with the innovations where they need to occur. Next slide, please. So that brings us to the end of our talk here. I hope I have convinced you that climate risk is complex, but not impossible to prepare and adapt for, and shown you how this unfolds in these contexts, the chronic hazards of chronic heat, as well as solutions that we may be sitting on top of and not even quite realizing. Next slide, please. Previous slide. Perfect. So there are a lot of different students who have contributed to this research, as well as one who is sitting in the audience here, Nadia Seagram, now many years ago, no longer a student. And I could have highlighted a lot of other projects that have really inspired and compelled me. So just want to say thank you to the whole group that has supported this work. And next slide, please. And I think we probably have a little bit of time for questions.
Your first part of the talk, you mentioned mental health in terms of how people are doing inside their homes. Could you expound upon like how it might affect their mental health, you know, if they're exposed to like really high heat? The second part is New York in risk of maybe being flooded? Is it I get the sense it's a flood prone town, but I'm not really sure. So, you know, if you could like expound upon that too.
Yeah, great. And I have a feeling there are a lot of people at the reception that's about to happen. We'd love to talk about that theme too. So in terms of mental health, it is well known that being really hot makes a lot of people feel more agitated, more anxious, and actually there are kind of a lot of pretty empirical studies that look at the ways that that can even translate into stressors and interpersonal interactions between people, and even forms of violence within urban context, for example. So basically what we were seeing in these households were people saying that it's super hard to be hot all the time. I can't focus, I'm stressed out, I feel agitated. And I think kind of, you know, just, I think about this all the time, having done all this work, you know, what do I feel like mentally when I step into a hot place? That is a very real impact of being too hot, especially too hot all the time, even though it seems easy to ignore because it is quote unquote just in our head, even though it has such wide-ranging consequences in our lives. So the work that we're doing now to kind of tease out what's happening household by household will be really trying to unfold some of those complex interactions. In the survey results I showed today is people just really saying that if we're too hot, we're much more likely to be saying at a household scale that we're experiencing mental health impacts. So yes, New York City has all sorts of flood impacts. During the break, maybe we're going to talk to Nadia, who's sitting right next to you. I think kind of, you know, the way that Sandy galvanized action on flood adaptation in New York City is really a profound example. There have been lots of different contemplations building from, you know, the rebuild by design to the big U to what's happened in Staten Island, many different examples. And many people here might know of the Coastlines and People collaboration. There's also been thinking about how to support that in real time. So there is a ton of work on flooding in New York City, also super sophisticated modeling of the flood hazards, much better than exists in many places. And I guess the example I always use is, if you look at the big new proposal for kind of putting a wall around the downtown of Manhattan, that might be one of the few places, or it's something like 10% of the global coastline, where that type of wall to keep water out under rising seas could be economically justifiable and also possible to finance. And so kind of thinking about what is the nature of the challenges, if you do put a wall, where does that redirect floodwaters? Super, super important to consider.
Great presentation, thanks so much. My question is, it seems at the end you're indicating that in Jersey what's working well is some of the more mundane things like zoning regulations. Have you seen anything in the research of why that isn't being implemented, kind of thinking reverse engineering, why isn't being implemented in other communities? Why aren't they doing more of those mundane things?
Yeah, it's such a good question. So I guess sometimes we talk a lot with local government officials that say, the hard thing is to make the building code, the standard, the zoning further out in terms of the level of ambition. It's easy to say, let's upgrade our code to the last disaster we saw, harder to do that in a forward-looking sense. I think another thing is often called the land use management paradox. So oftentimes places don't realize they have a flood problem until they build out a floodplain, then it floods them, the flood zone gets mapped, and then they join a community rating program. So like oftentimes what's happening is you're flying blind in initial development in a location. You're just kind of almost accidentally putting the homes and stuff in places prone to flooding. And once you have development there, it tends to aggregate in terms of more development. And only at that point in time do you model flooding and realize, oops, we have just built out that floodplain. I think for some locations, it really is the coastal amenity effect where, coming from Miami, right, people are building in places that are just phenomenally susceptible to flooding, storm surge, and sea level rise. And there's kind of no stopping it because people want that view. And I think kind of thinking about how to rejigger that into the future is the hard thing. I think in a way, oftentimes when we present this work with local governments as well, they kind of feel, fortified in their choices, right? They know that it's not just having a law or policy on the books, it's implementing that through time. So kind of that next step of, is there something on the books that could be effective, but everyone is giving variances to it? Or is it on the books and being enforced? That is also kind of a key difference between just the quality of the tool in the first place and how well it's being implemented as well. Thank you.
We have time for one more question.
You spend a considerable time talking about air conditioning. I was wondering, would dehumidifiers be another approach without worrying about the temperature so much? It's the comfort level and low humidity.
Yes, yeah, great point. So in a hot, humid climate, the dehumidification that is happening in your AC HVAC system, super, super important. And I think as we kind of think about moving into the future, where is it dry, humid heat that is the challenge? Where is it dry heat that is the challenge? Where is it humid heat? And oftentimes you can apply different types of tools. Sometimes it can be enough to just dehumidify and you get a much more comfortable environment. In Miami-Dade, you often need both cooling and dehumidification. And I mean, if you look at the water spouting out of an HVAC system, we water our garden with the water coming out of our AC system. And really a phenomenal amount of the energy going into the system is to pull that water out of the air. And actually one interesting twist as well is that as we think about how building has evolved in higher wealth tropical locations through time, oftentimes the response has been to insulate the home super, super well. But in these humid homes, what you're often getting is like the super well insulated attic is now filled with mold because it's really, really hard to get that humid air out of the home overall. So there are trade-offs that become really vexing when you've got the humidity in there in addition to the temperature. Okay, thank you all.